My granddaughter put her hand flat on my chest and pushed me out of my own front door. And the last thing I heard before it clicked shut behind me was the music from inside and the laughter of 30 people who hadn't thought to ask where I'd gone. That was a Saturday night in October. By Sunday morning, when my attorney called Brianna to inform her that the will had been amended 4 days prior and that the entirety of the Whitmore estate, all $20,340,000 of it, had been redirected in full, the laughter had stopped. I know it had stopped because I was sitting in my car at the end of the driveway, in the dark, and I heard her scream from inside the house. Some sounds carry, especially the ones that are a long time coming. But I am getting ahead of myself, which is a habit of old women who have waited a long time to tell their story and find, when the moment finally arrives, that they want to begin at the end. Let me go back. Let me go back to the beginning, which was not that Saturday in October, and was not even the year that Brianna moved into my house and began the slow, patient, thoroughly pleasant process of making me feel like a guest in it. The beginning is further back than that. The beginning is my husband Harold's hands. Harold had carpenter's hands, wide, square-palmed, with short, thick fingers and permanently stained knuckles, because he spent 40 years working wood and no amount of soap ever fully persuaded the grain out of the lines of his skin. I loved those hands. I loved them when I was 23, and he reached across a diner counter and fixed the clasp on my watch without being asked. And I loved them when he was 71, and they shook slightly when he poured his morning coffee. And I loved them when they lay still on the hospital blanket in the last week, when there was nothing left to do but sit beside him and hold them and let the afternoon light move across the room. Harold built things. He built furniture that people kept for generations, and he built a business from nothing, and he built, with the same patient, unhurried craftsmanship he brought to everything, a life for us that was solid and warm and required very little in the way of drama, because it had been constructed with too much care to fall apart easily. He built it for me, and for our daughter Carol, and for Carol's daughter Brianna. Though Brianna came late, Carol had her at 41, which surprised everyone including Carol, and Harold used to say that Brianna was the universe's way of giving them a second chance at something, though he never specified what. She was a beautiful baby and a bright and lovely little girl, and she sat on Harold's knee at his workbench and watched him with her enormous dark eyes while he explained what each tool was for, and he called her his apprentice, though she showed no particular interest in woodworking and a very great deal of interest in Harold's credit card. We laughed about that. We laughed about a lot of things, in those years when Brianna was small and Harold was healthy, and the workshop smelled of cedar shavings and linseed oil, and the future seemed like a very pleasant place. Harold died when Brianna was 19. It was a Tuesday. He had pancreatic cancer, which is the kind of cancer that does not give you very much time to prepare, and he spent the 8 months between diagnosis and death with the same unhurried deliberateness he had brought to everything, putting things in order, finishing a blanket chest he'd been working on for a neighbor, making sure I knew where everything was and how everything worked, and who to call for the things I'd always let him handle. He was not afraid. Or if he was, he kept it internal, which was his way, and what emerged outward was a kind of clear-eyed, practical tenderness that I have tried to emulate ever since and have only partially managed. He died on a Tuesday morning with my hand in his, and the room was very quiet, and the light was the pale gold of early autumn, and afterward I sat there for a long time before I called anyone, because I wanted a few more minutes of the world in which he was still in it. He left everything to me. The house, which was paid off. The business, which I sold 18 months later to a young couple who had the right hands for it and the right ideas. The investment accounts, which Harold had tended with the same methodical care he brought to everything else, and which had grown over 40 years into something that surprised even me when the attorney laid out the full picture. $20,340,000. Harold had been building that too, quietly, the way he built everything. Not for show, not for the feeling of having it, but because he wanted me to be safe. Because he knew he would go first, and he wanted me to be safe. I was 73 when Harold died. My name is Ruth Whitmore, and I have lived in the same house for 41 years. A white 2-story colonial on Elm Crest Road with a porch that wraps around 2 sides and a garden that Harold planted and that I have tended in his absence with varying degrees of success. Carol lives 40 minutes away with her husband Dennis, and Brianna, by the time of Harold's death, was in her second year of a communications degree at a state university and coming home for holidays. The holidays were good in those first years after Harold, not happy exactly, but warm, the way things are warm when people are trying, when the loss is fresh enough that everyone is still being careful with each other. Brianna brought friends home at Thanksgiving. She called on birthdays. She sat with me on the porch in the summers and we talked about Harold. And she cried sometimes, and I held her, and it was real. I know it was real, because I know the difference now between the thing and the performance of the thing, and what Brianna was doing in those early years was not a performance. She genuinely grieved him. She genuinely loved me. I want to be accurate about that, because it's important. What happened later was not the revelation of a person who was never anything but calculating. It was something slower and more complicated than that. The gradual replacement of a genuine feeling with a comfortable assumption, and then the replacement of that assumption with something that was just, simply, greed. The change began to be visible, which is not the same thing, about 2 years after Harold died. Brianna graduated. She moved to the city. She got a job in marketing at a firm that did something with social media that I never fully understood, and she met a man named Kyle, who was good-looking in an unmemorable way, and who shook my hand firmly and called me Mrs. Whitmore with a punctiliousness that I found slightly exhausting. They dated. They became serious. Kyle had opinions about real estate and investment strategies and the general management of assets, and he expressed these opinions in the patient, measured tone of someone who has decided that the older person he is talking to needs things explained slowly and simply. I did not find this charming. I found it mildly insulting in the way that only becomes visible in retrospect, the way you realize later that the water has been rising for some time before you notice it's wet. Brianna started calling more often. This sounds like a good thing, and some part of me registered it as a good thing. But the calls had a quality to them that was subtly different from the calls of the previous 2 years. They were warmer and more frequent, but they were also more structured, if that makes sense, more goal-directed, as if each call had an agenda that was being worked through beneath the level of the conversation. She asked about my health with a focus and specificity that went slightly beyond granddaughterly concern. She asked about the house, whether I'd thought about the upkeep, whether the roof had been done recently, whether I found it difficult to manage alone. She asked with a casualness that I registered but did not immediately examine, whether I'd spoken to an attorney lately about the estate documents, whether Harold's will had been the last time things had been formally reviewed. I told her the estate was in order. I said it pleasantly, because I am a pleasant woman and because there was nothing in what she was asking that I could point to as wrong. It was the kind of thing a thoughtful granddaughter might ask. It was the kind of thing someone who loved you and was thinking about your future might want to know. I told myself that, and I believe myself when I say I believed it. I was not naive. I had 73 years of evidence that I was not naive. But I was in the particular position of someone who does not want to find the thing they half suspect they might be looking for, and so they do not look very hard. Carol noticed before I did. Carol is my daughter, and she is not a woman who misses things, and she called me one evening in March. Brianna had been in the city for almost 3 years by then, and said, in the direct way she has always had, "Mum, has Brianna said anything to you about the estate?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Kyle is talking. To people in their circle, apparently, about the Whitmore money. He's been characterizing it as something that's coming to them." A pause on the line. I heard it second-hand, through Janet. You remember Janet, from Dennis's firm. She knows someone who knows someone in Kyle's social group. He apparently refers to it as their inheritance, present tense. I sat with that for a moment. The phone felt heavier than usual against my ear, which I remember specifically, the slight cold weight of it. I said, "He probably just misspoke. He probably meant eventual. People talk carelessly about those things." Carol said, "Maybe." Another pause, longer. "I just want you to be aware, Mom. That's all." I was aware, and then I put the awareness somewhere it could sit quietly without disturbing anything, and I continued to have my Tuesday evening calls with Brianna and my monthly lunches with Carol and my mornings in Harold's garden. And the spring came in with its usual reliable beauty, and the roses along the back fence did something wonderful, and I let time pass. What I did not know what I had no reason to know, and what only became clear much later, was that Brianna had, in the 6 months following Carol's call, been having a series of conversations with people in the city about financial and estate planning. Not with me. Not with Carol. With a lawyer of her own, and with a financial advisor who specialized in something called legacy wealth management, which is a phrase that sounds like it means one thing and in practice means quite another. She had, in those conversations, been exploring the question of what legal mechanisms existed for challenging the mental competence of an aging relative. She had been asking about conservatorships. She had been asking about the process by which a person might seek to have themselves named as a family member's financial manager on the grounds of diminished capacity. I did not know any of this in March or April or May. I found it out in September, and the way I found it out is a story in itself, and I will get there. But for now, what matters is that the water was rising, and I was not looking at the water. Summer arrived. Brianna called in June to say that she and Kyle were thinking about visiting in August. Would that work? I said of course. She said they might bring some friends, if that was all right, just a small group. Maybe a barbecue in the garden. I said that sounded lovely. Harold's garden in August is at its best. The hydrangeas along the south wall are midsummer fat, and the lawn is the deep green of well-watered grass. And the idea of filling it with people felt right to me, the way the house had always felt right when it was full. Harold and I used to host constantly, his business colleagues, my book group, the neighborhood children who treated our porch as an extension of the park. The house was built to hold people. So I said yes, and I meant it. They arrived on the Saturday of the second weekend in August, Brianna and Kyle and 4 of their friends, a couple named Josh and Madison, and 2 single women named Taylor and Priya, whose last names I never reliably retained. They were all in their late 20s or early 30s, bright-faced and easy in that way of people for whom the world has not yet presented its more intractable problems, and they moved through my house with the comfortable energy of people who feel at home in a place, which is a good feeling to give a host. I was glad of it, genuinely. I made lemonade and put out the good cheese and watched the garden fill with voices and laughter, and Brianna came and sat beside me on the porch for 20 minutes in the afternoon and held my hand and said, "This is so good, Grandma. This is what this place is for." And I thought, yes, it is. And I thought, she means it. And she did. I'm certain of that. She meant it in that moment. The first thing that snagged that August visit was small. It happened on the Sunday morning when most of the group was still asleep and Brianna was making coffee in my kitchen. I came downstairs early, as I always do, and found her at the counter with her phone propped against the fruit bowl. And she was on a call, FaceTime, I think, or something like it, with a person I didn't recognize, a man in a suit in what appeared to be an office. She looked up when I came in, and something shifted in her face. Not guilt, exactly, not a flinch, but a rapid recalibration. The kind you do when you've been doing something you weren't expecting to be seen doing. She said, smoothly and immediately, "Gran, good morning, let me call you back." And she ended the call, and she put the phone face down on the counter, and she said, "I was just checking in with someone from work. Early Riser Club." She smiled. It was a good smile. I said, "Coffee smells wonderful." Because it did. And because I was not ready, that Sunday morning, to ask the question I had just registered the need to ask. But I looked at the back of her phone on the counter, face down on the marble, and I thought, that was not someone from work. Not because of anything Brianna had said. She'd said nothing incriminating, nothing explicit. But there is a quality of conversation that changes when someone is talking to a person they have hired. A particular mixture of deference and direction that is different from the easy back and forth of colleagues. I have been in business. I know the register. And the man in the suit in the office on a Sunday morning on a call that ended the moment I walked into the room, that was not a colleague. That was a professional. And the thought that he was a professional who was being consulted about something that required a Sunday morning call, something that required ending the moment I appeared, settled in my chest like a stone dropping into still water. Slowly, without a splash, making almost no sound at all. I told no one about that. Not yet. September came. I had a routine medical appointment with my doctor, Dr. Anand, who has been my physician for 14 years and who is the kind of doctor who actually reads your chart before you walk in, which is rarer than it should be. It was a routine checkup, nothing concerning, and afterward we sat in his office for the few minutes he allows himself for conversation, and he asked how I was managing, how the house felt, whether I had people around me. He asked these things because he always asks these things, because he is thorough, and because he knows that the practical loneliness of old age is a clinical concern as much as a social one. I told him I was fine. I told him about Brianna's visit. I told him the garden was good this year. He said, good, and the legal and financial side of things, is all of that in order? Estate documents, powers of attorney, that sort of thing? He said it in the same neutral professional tone he uses for all the standard checklist items, and I said yes, everything was in order, and he nodded and made a note. And then he said, I ask partly because I've had a request, and I want to be transparent with you about this immediately. From an attorney who reached out on behalf of a family member asking for documentation of your cognitive assessment, specifically requesting records pertaining to your memory and judgment. He looked at me steadily over his desk. I did not provide anything. Your records are yours, and I would never share them without your explicit consent. But I thought you should know the request was made. My hands were in my lap. I felt them dimly, as separate from me, still but separate, as if they belonged to someone who was watching from a distance. I said, what family member? He said, the request came through a firm called Heller and Associates. I don't have information about the specific client, only that it was characterized as a family inquiry. He paused. Ruth, I want to ask you directly. Are you concerned about anything? Is there anything going on that I should know about? I looked at him across his desk, and the room was very quiet, and the fluorescent light above him made a faint, continuous sound that I had never noticed before. I said, I think my granddaughter is trying to establish grounds for a competency challenge. I said it in a very ordinary voice, as if I were saying something very ordinary, because sometimes the only way to say an extraordinary thing is to use an ordinary voice for it, or else the weight of it will knock you down before you've had a chance to understand what you're carrying. Dr. Anand looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, Is she? I said, I believe so. He said, well. He picked up his pen. He set it down again. Then I would suggest you speak to an attorney of your own, immediately. And I would suggest, he paused with the care of a man choosing words that will carry, that you document everything going forward. Every request, every conversation, every contact. He paused again. I have 30 years of your records, Ruth. 30 years of entirely normal cognitive assessments, no concerns whatsoever, consistently high function. Any competency challenge would face a very high bar. He said it simply, not as comfort, but as fact. But it would be better to get ahead of this. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 25 minutes after that appointment. I did not cry. I have never been a woman who cries in parking lots, though I understand why people do. I sat and I looked at the windshield and I thought about Harold's hands, the way they'd looked in those last weeks on the hospital blanket, and I thought about the blanket chest he'd finished for the neighbor and the investment accounts he'd tended so carefully for 40 years and the house on Elm Crest Road that he'd paid off and left to me clean and free. And I thought about a lawyer in a suit on a Sunday morning on Brianna's phone, and I thought about the phrase, their inheritance, in present tense, and I thought about the question she had asked at Easter, so casually, so warmly, about whether I'd ever thought of simplifying things by moving into something smaller, whether it might not be easier, at my age, to have fewer things to manage. At my age, I had been 74. I was not, at 74, struggling to manage anything. I ran the house, maintained the garden, managed my finances through an investment advisor who reported to me quarterly, read 2 books a week, and drove myself wherever I needed to go. I had, at 74, the daily competence of someone with no reason to think about whether they were competent, which is, I now understood, exactly the condition that a certain kind of person finds inconvenient. I drove home. I went into Harold's study, which I had kept mostly as he left it. His drafting table, his reference books, the model of the blanket chest on the shelf above the desk. And I sat at his desk, and I called an attorney named Martin Feld, who had been recommended to me by Carol's husband Dennis as the person you want when someone is trying to take something from you. I had written his number in the small address book I keep in my purse weeks earlier, after Carol's call in March, and had not used it, and now I took it out and looked at it and dialed. Martin Feld answered on the third ring. I told him my name and that I had been referred by Dennis Park and that I had a situation I needed to discuss. He said he had availability the following Tuesday. I said Tuesday was fine. He said he'd see me then. I hung up and sat in Harold's study for a while. The drafting table had a faint smell that was still, after 5 years, his, linseed oil and cedar and something warm and mineral that I have never been able to name. I put my hands flat on the desk surface the way he used to when he was thinking. The wood was smooth under my palms and cool and very solid. I thought, all right then. All right. Martin Feld's office was on the 6th floor of a building downtown, and his waiting room had the serious quiet of a space that has been designed to communicate that serious things happen here. The receptionist offered me coffee, which I accepted, and I sat with it in a chair that was very comfortable and waited and thought about nothing in particular, which is a skill I have developed over many years and which I find useful in proportion to the seriousness of the occasion. The more serious the occasion, the more useful it is to be able to think about nothing in particular. It is a form of conservation. Martin Feld was in his mid-50s, compact and attentive, with the kind of face that gives nothing away without deciding to give it away. He shook my hand, and his handshake was firm without being performative, and he gestured me to the chair across from his desk and sat down and folded his hands and said, "Tell me everything." I told him everything. I told him about Dr. Annan's call. I told him about the Sunday morning and the man in the suit on Brianna's phone. I told him about March and Carol's information and the phrase "their inheritance." I told him about the questions Brianna had been asking about the house and the estate documents and my cognitive function. I told him about Kyle and his opinions about asset management. I told him all of it in order, which took about 25 minutes, and Martin Feld listened without interrupting, making occasional notes on a legal pad in a small, precise handwriting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And the current state of the estate documents? Will, powers of attorney, healthcare directive?" I told him. Harold's will had been probated. The estate had passed to me entirely. My own will, drafted 3 years after Harold's death, left the estate split between Carol and Brianna 50-50. There was a durable power of attorney naming Carol as my agent. There was a healthcare directive. He said, "You have not given anyone, Carol, Brianna, Kyle, anyone, any authority over your finances at present." I said, "No." He said, "Good." He picked up his pen. "Now, the competency challenge route is a legitimate legal mechanism, but it's a high bar, and for someone of your evident cognitive capacity, with the documented medical history you're describing, it would be a very difficult thing to sustain. What they'd need to establish is that you lack the capacity to manage your own affairs, and Dr. Annan's records would be among the first things a court would examine." He paused. "I want to be honest with you, Mrs. Whitmore. The request your doctor received is concerning. It suggests this is not casual conversation. It's a process that has begun, which means you have a window and you should use it." I said, "A window to do what?" He said, "To make sure your estate documents reflect exactly what you want them to reflect, clearly and unambiguously, while your capacity is unquestionable and documented." He looked at me. "If there's anything you want to change," I said, "there is." The silence in his office was very specific. He looked at me. I looked at him. Outside the window, the city was doing its ordinary things. I said, "I would like to amend my will." He said, "Tell me what you have in mind." What I had in mind had been forming since the parking lot outside Dr. Annan's office, or perhaps since Carol's call in March, or perhaps since the Sunday morning and the man in the suit, or perhaps since the first time Brianna asked whether I'd considered moving somewhere smaller. It had been forming the way Harold's furniture formed. Slowly, with attention, each joint fitted carefully before the next was begun, so that when the thing was done, it was solid all the way through. What I had in mind was not revenge, though it had that quality when I explained it to Martin Feld. What it was, in fact, was clarity. I was clarifying something that had become obscured. I was removing an ambiguity. I was ensuring that the money Harold had spent 40 years building would go where he would have wanted it to go, which was to people who understood what it was for and would use it accordingly. There is a foundation called the Whitmore Woodworking Foundation that does not exist yet, but will, because I am going to create it. It will fund vocational programs for young people who want to learn to work with their hands, carpentry, joinery, cabinet making, in communities where those programs have been cut. Harold would have loved it. I can say that with certainty because I knew Harold for 51 years and I know what he loved. He would have loved the idea of his name on a workshop full of young people learning what wood can become under patient hands. He would have been embarrassed by the scale of it. He would have come around. The rest, the house, a portion of the liquid assets, I was leaving to Carol. Carol, who had called me in March to warn me. Carol, who drove 40 minutes to bring me soup when I had the flu last January without being asked. Carol, who had sat on the phone with me on the first anniversary of Harold's death and simply stayed on the line, not talking, just there, because she knew that what I needed was not words. Carol understood what the estate was. She understood it was Harold's life's work, rendered into numbers, and she would take care of it accordingly because she takes care of things that matter. Brianna. Brianna, whom I had loved with the specific, uncomplicated love of a grandmother who watched a child become a person, who had held her on Harold's knee at the workbench and called her his apprentice. Brianna, who had cried real tears at Harold's grave and meant them. Brianna, who had looked at $20 million and seen not her grandfather's life, but a problem to be solved, a resource to be accessed, a thing that was coming to her whether I agreed or not. Brianna, who had hired an attorney to inquire about my mental competence to a doctor who had cared for me for 30 years. What Brianna would receive from the estate of Ruth and Harold Whitmore was this: $100,000, held in trust until the age of 40, with the condition that it be used for educational purposes, the condition being a nod to who she had been at 19, who she might still become if she found her way back to the person who had cried at Harold's grave and meant it. Martin Feld drafted the amendment with the precision and thoroughness I had hoped for from him. We met twice more that week, once to review the draft, once to execute it. The execution happened on a Wednesday afternoon in his office, witnessed by 2 members of his staff, notarized, documented with a videotaped statement from me articulating my reasoning and my intentions in clear and unambiguous terms, a record that would be very difficult for anyone to challenge on the grounds of diminished capacity, particularly in conjunction with Dr. Annan's 30 years of records. Martin Feld filed the amendment, kept a copy, sent a copy to the estate vault. He said, "You should know that nothing about this needs to be disclosed to anyone until the time of your death, or until you choose to disclose it. The document is yours." He looked at me. "Is there anything else you want to put in place?" I thought about that. I thought about the party Brianna had mentioned. She'd called the week before to say she was planning a birthday celebration for Kyle, an early October party, and she'd love to have it at the house. Wouldn't that be wonderful? All her friends in Grandma's beautiful garden, the house is so perfect for it. You'd love having the energy in the place again. She'd said it warmly. She'd said it with the ease of someone who considers a request to be a formality rather than an actual question. I said to Martin Feld, "I am going to be at a party in a few weeks, and I think something is going to happen at the party, and I would like to be prepared for whatever it is." He said, "Tell me about the party." I told him about the party. He said, "Do you want me to be available that weekend?" I said, "I think that might be wise." October arrived with its cool, clear days and its particular quality of light, lower than summer light, more golden, coming in at an angle that makes everything look slightly more itself than it usually does, if that makes sense. The garden was past its peak, but still beautiful in the subdued way of autumn gardens. The roses spent, the hydrangeas faded to paper, but the Japanese maple in the corner blazing in a way that Harold had planted it specifically to do, a deliberate piece of theatre he'd planned 20 years in advance. He had been that kind of man. Brianna arrived on the Friday evening before the party with Kyle and 2 carloads of friends and a rental van containing what appeared to be DJ equipment and a quantity of fairy lights that struck me as optically ambitious for an early October evening. She hugged me at the door with genuine warmth and said the house looked beautiful and asked if I'd eaten and brought me a container of soup she'd apparently made herself, which I found touching. She was, and I want to be precise about this, entirely herself that evening, not performing affection she didn't feel, not being strategic. She was Brianna, my granddaughter, bringing her friends to her grandmother's house for a party, and she loved me, and I loved her, and neither of those things was false. The thing that was false was what she thought the future looked like. And that was not her fault alone. She had built that false picture on the foundation of an assumption I had never explicitly corrected, which is partly on me. I had meant to. I had simply not done it quickly enough. The Saturday of the party was warm for October, one of those borrowed days that appear at the end of the season like a final unexpected gift and make you think the summer hasn't quite finished with you yet. By 5 o'clock, the garden was full of people and music, and the fairy lights that had seemed so ambitious were in fact entirely appropriate, strung through the Japanese maple and along the fence and across the garden in a way that was actually very beautiful. I had to admit it was beautiful. I walked through the party and spoke to people and accepted introductions and felt, genuinely, the particular happiness of a full house. The thing Harold and I had always wanted the house to do. The thing it was built for. I found a chair on the side of the porch and sat with a glass of wine and watched the garden for a while. Kyle was holding court near the hydrangea wall with several men his age, talking with the animated authority of someone who is the largest person in his own head. Brianna was moving through the crowd with the social fluency of a person in her element, which she was. She is good with people, always has been, warm and easy and genuinely interested. Her friends were nice. The music was too loud, but not unreasonably so. It was a good party. At around 8 o'clock, Brianna came to find me. She crouched down beside my chair and said, with a warmth that was absolutely real, "Having fun, Gran?" I said I was. She said, "Good. You look wonderful, you know, totally in your element." I smiled. She reached out and squeezed my hand. Then she straightened up and looked across the garden and said, with the particular quality of someone steering toward something, "Actually, Gran, some of Kyle's friends are a bit intense. Work people, finance people, you know how they are. And Kyle's going to do a little speech soon, and it might get a bit rowdy, loud. I thought maybe you might want to take yourself inside. Get comfortable? I can bring you some food." She said it gently. She said it with concern. She said it the way you say something you have planned to say and have rehearsed slightly and are now delivering in the most natural possible voice. I looked at her. She looked at me. Between us, in that moment, was everything that had happened, and everything that she did not know I knew, and everything she thought she was managing. It was a great deal of information to fit into a look. But we fit it. I said, "I think I'll stay a little longer." She said, still gently, "The thing is, Gran." And she stopped, and in the stopping I heard her recalibrate, moving from the first approach to the second, the one she'd prepared for if the first didn't work. She said, "You know how Kyle's friends can be. They'll want to talk business, and it gets complicated, and honestly, you'd be more comfortable inside. I'll come check on you every 20 minutes. I said, "Brianna." Just her name, in the voice I used to use when she was 8 and doing something she knew she shouldn't. She straightened up fully. Something shifted in her face, not dropping the warmth exactly, but the warmth adjusting around the edges of something harder and more impatient. She said, "Gran, I love you, but this is a young people's party. You've been wonderful. You've been the perfect host. But it's getting late and—" She stopped again. She looked across the garden. Then she looked back at me, and she said it, in a voice that was half embarrassed and half fully meaning it. "You're a little too old for this party, Gran. Why don't you go inside?" And then, because words apparently were not going to be sufficient, she put her hand on my arm and she turned me, gently but with purpose, toward the front door, which someone had opened, and she guided me through it, and she clicked it shut behind me. I stood in my own front hallway. The music came through the walls, muffled. The hallway smelled of the house, wood polish and old wool from the runner and the faint ghost of Harold's pipe, which had been years ago but had never entirely left. There was a coat rack beside the door where Harold's good jacket still hung, the tweed one with the leather elbow patches that I could not bring myself to move. I looked at that jacket for a long moment. I could hear laughter through the walls. I could hear Kyle's voice, carrying the way voices do when the speaker is confident of his audience. I walked through my own hallway, past Harold's jacket, to Harold's study. I sat at Harold's desk. I put my hands flat on the wood the way he used to. And I picked up my phone and I called Martin Feld, and when he answered, I said, "I'd like you to call her tomorrow morning. Early." He said, "Consider it done." That night I slept in my own bed in my own house while the party went on around me. Or rather, I lay in my own bed because sleep was not available. Not really. Not with the music and the occasional burst of laughter and the particular quality of wakefulness that comes when you know that something is happening and you are choosing to let it happen because you have already put in place everything that needs to be in place. I lay in the dark and listened to the party and thought about Harold. I thought about the afternoon I'd first seen him across a diner counter, fixing a stranger's watch clasp without being asked. And I thought about 51 years of mornings together, and the way he'd folded his newspaper, and the way he'd talked to Brianna at his workbench, and the way his hands had felt in mine in the last week. I thought about 40 years of careful building, of tending something so that it would last, and I thought, it will last, because I am going to make sure it lasts, because that is what I owe him. I fell asleep around 3 and woke at 6:30, which is my usual time, and the house was quiet in the way it is quiet after a party. The particular silence of spaces that have been full and are now empty, with the residue of presence still faintly in the air. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and waited. Martin Feld called Brianna at 8:15. I know because he told me the time afterward, and because I heard from upstairs where she was apparently sleeping in the guest room, the sound of her phone ringing, and then her voice, initially muzzy with sleep, then sharpening rapidly, and then a sound I have only once before heard from her, when Harold died, which was a sound too large for language, a kind of involuntary vocalization of something that has no words. She came downstairs 4 minutes later. She was in pajamas, her hair undone, her face the face of someone who has received an injury so sudden and complete that the body hasn't processed it yet. Pale, slightly blank, with an expression that was not yet grief or anger, but was the immediate precursor to both. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at me across the table with my coffee. I looked back at her. She said in a voice that was barely controlled, "You changed the will." I said, "I did." She said, "When?" I said, 4 days before Kyle's party. A pause. Behind her in the hallway, Kyle appeared, also sleep-disheveled, also in pajamas, and he took in the scene with the rapid calculation of a man who does not have enough information yet and knows it. He said, "Bree." She held up one hand without looking at him, and he stopped. She said, "The foundation." I said, "The Whitmore Woodworking Foundation. It will fund vocational programs in woodworking and cabinet making. Your grandfather built everything we had with his hands." It seemed right. Her jaw worked for a moment. The color was coming back into her face now, and it was the pink of anger, not grief. She said, "And me." I said, $100,000, in trust until you're 40, designated for educational purposes. The silence in the kitchen was the kind that has physical weight. The coffee maker made a small sound. Kyle, in the doorway, was very still. She said, "You're doing this because of the party." I said, "I'm doing this because of the Sunday morning in August when you were on the phone with an attorney in my kitchen and ended the call when I walked in, and because of the request to Dr. Annan's office asking for my cognitive records, and because of the conversations you've been having about conservatorships." I said it without heat, without drama, in the voice I had decided on, which was the voice of a woman who has done her thinking and is not interested in being persuaded that she has done it wrong. The party was simply the last thing, the clearest thing. Brianna said nothing. She looked at me across the kitchen table with an expression that was shifting rapidly through several things at once: anger, and something that was trying to be indignation, and something underneath both of those that was, I think, recognition. The recognition of someone who has been seen, who knows they have been seen, who is calculating in real time whether there is any road forward from being seen. Kyle said from the doorway, you can't just, there are grounds to contest this. On the basis of, I looked at him. He stopped. I said, Martin Feld's office executed the amendment 4 days ago. It was witnessed, notarized, and accompanied by a videotaped statement of intent that Dr. Annan's 30 years of records will thoroughly support. You are welcome to consult your own attorney. I paused. You've apparently already begun. He said nothing. His face was doing something complicated. Beside him, Brianna put her hand on the doorframe, as if she needed it for support. I said in the same even voice, "You called me too old for the party last night. You put your hand on my arm, and you walked me to the door of my own house, and you shut the door behind me." I let that sit for a moment. I have been in this house for 41 years. Harold built everything in it. He built it for me. And no one... I paused because the voice wanted to do something then, some edge or crack, and I would not let it. I had decided I would not let it. I breathed once. No one will walk me to the door of my own house and shut the door behind me. Not at any age. The kitchen was very quiet. Brianna said softly, after a long moment, "Gran." Just my name, the way she used to say it when she was small. I said, "I think you should pack your things." She looked at me. She started to say something, stopped. She looked at Kyle, who looked away. She looked back at me, and in her face, and I am going to be accurate about this, because accuracy is what I owe the full truth of the situation. In her face was not only the anger and the calculation I expected. There was something else. Something smaller and more genuine, buried under everything else, like an object dropped in deep water. Grief, maybe. Or the particular shame that comes from being caught doing something you knew, at some level, was wrong. I don't know. I will probably never know for certain. But I saw it. She nodded. She turned. She went upstairs. Kyle stood in the doorway for one more moment. He opened his mouth. Then he closed it. Then he turned and went upstairs after her. I picked up my coffee. The morning light came through the kitchen window at the particular autumn angle, low, golden, at the slant that makes everything look more itself. Harold's jacket hung in the hallway, just visible from the kitchen table, the tweed shoulders and the leather patches worn soft. I looked at it. I drank my coffee, and I thought, this house is mine. This morning is mine. Everything Harold built is exactly where it should be. And I am 77 years old, and I have just done the thing I needed to do, and my hands are entirely steady. They were gone by 11. I heard them move through the house, voices low, the sound of bags, a door, and then a car in the driveway, and then the crunch of gravel, and then nothing. The front door was closed. The house settled around me, the way houses do when they return to their own quiet. Not the quiet of emptiness, but the quiet of a place that has been itself for a long time and knows how to be itself. I went out to the garden. The fairy lights were still strung through the Japanese maple from the night before. Someone would need to take them down, but not yet. The maple blazed in the October light, red and gold, exactly as Harold had planned it. He had planted it as a sapling and had known he would not see it full grown, and he had planted it anyway, because he thought in those terms, not in what he would see, but in what would be there. I stood in the garden for a while, in the morning quiet, with Harold's maple above me and the coffee in my hand going cold, and I thought about all of it. The Sunday morning and Dr. Annan's call and Martin Feld's office and the sound of the party through the walls at midnight and the hand on my arm at the front door. And I thought about Harold at his drafting table, head bent, patient, building something that would outlast him. And I thought, so have I. So have I. The months that followed were quieter than I expected, and in many ways, the best months I had spent in the house since Harold died. Carol came for Thanksgiving, and it was the two of us and Dennis and their son, Michael, and we ate well and talked honestly, and there was a quality to the day that I found I had been missing without knowing I'd been missing it. The quality of people who are not performing anything, who are simply themselves, together. Carol asked at some point in the evening, "Are you all right, Mom? Really?" And I said yes. And she looked at me for a moment and said, "You know you did the right thing." I said I knew. She said, "Dad would have..." She stopped, started again. "He would have been very clear about it." I said I knew that too. The Whitmore Woodworking Foundation was incorporated in January. Martin Feld handled the legal structure. A woman named Diane Cho, who ran a non-profit consulting firm that Dennis had recommended, handled the operational framework. We identified 3 vocational programs in communities that had lost their school woodworking shops in budget cuts, 2 in rural counties, 1 in an urban school district, and we funded them through the first year and established the mechanism for ongoing support. The announcement was quiet and local and generated a small article in the regional paper with a photograph of Harold from his workshop, the one where he's at the drafting table with his glasses on and his good plaid shirt, looking slightly irritated at being photographed, which was his usual reaction to being photographed. I kept the article on the refrigerator with the magnet that says, "Made with Love in Vermont," that Carol gave me years ago. Brianna did not contact me for 4 months. When she did, it was a letter, not an email. A letter, handwritten, 3 pages, on the good cream-colored stationery she'd bought herself at some point, and that I recognized. The letter was not an apology exactly, or rather it was an apology about some things and not others, and the things it apologized for were real, and the things it didn't were also real, and I think she knew both. She wrote about Harold. She wrote about the workbench and the crossword puzzles. She wrote about being small and sitting on his knee, and the way the workshop had smelled, and the way he'd explained things, not explaining down to her, but across, as if she were someone worth explaining things to properly. She wrote at the end, "I think I confused what I was owed with what I was afraid of losing. I don't know if that makes it better or worse." And then, "I'm sorry, Gran. For the door. For the door." I read the letter twice, then I put it on Harold's desk, in the study, next to the model of the blanket chest on the shelf. I did not respond immediately. I thought about it for 3 days, and then I wrote back. 2 pages, also by hand, on the cream stationery she'd given me last Christmas, which I had put away and saved. I told her that I loved her. I told her that I had always loved her, and continued to love her and would love her, though the relationship between us had changed in ways that would take time to understand. I told her about the foundation. I told her Harold had planted the Japanese maple, knowing he would never see it full grown. I told her the $100,000 in trust would be there when she was 40, and I hoped by then she would know what she wanted to do with an education. I told her that whatever she decided, she would have to build it herself. I sent the letter. I did not know what would happen next, which was all right. The not knowing had a different quality now. Not the not knowing of someone who has been kept in the dark, but the not knowing of someone who has done what they could with what they had and is willing to let time do the rest. There is a difference. It is considerable. Spring came back to the garden, as it always does, reliable as anything I know. The roses along the south fence put out their first tentative growth, and I pruned them the way Harold taught me. Not too early, not too late, and always at the angle that sends the new growth outward instead of inward. The Japanese maple leafed out in the corner, doing what it was always going to do. The birds came back to the feeders Harold had put up, which I kept full, which I will always keep full. I planted sweet peas along the fence the way I do every year because Harold loved sweet peas, and because the act of planting something that will grow long after the planting is a form of faith I have come to rely on. One morning in April, I was at the kitchen table with my coffee, the good coffee, the kind I make properly now, because I have stopped saving the good things for occasions and started treating Tuesday mornings as occasions, because they all are. And the light was coming through the window at the flat, bright angle of spring light, which is different from the autumn light and from the summer light, and is its own particular thing, fresh and a little startling, the way beginnings always are. Harold's jacket hung in the hallway. It has hung there for 5 years, and it will hang there for as long as I am in this house, which I expect will be a long time. Not because I can't move it, because I don't want to. I drank my coffee. It was very good. Outside in the garden, something was happening with the birds, some complex negotiation at the feeder that I have never fully decoded and that I do not need to decode, because the complexity of it is its own reward, and watching it is enough. I am 77 years old, and I live in my own house, and I sleep in my own bed, and I drink good coffee at my own kitchen table, and I manage my own affairs with complete competence. Thank you, Dr. Anand, Martin Feld, 30 years of records. I have built a foundation in Harold's name that is, as I write this, funding 3 workshops full of young people learning what wood can become under patient hands. I have a daughter who calls every Tuesday and comes with soup when I am sick, and sat on the phone with me on the anniversary and stayed on the line. I have a granddaughter who sent me a 3-page handwritten letter and wrote in the end for the door. I have a garden that Harold planted and that I tend, and a maple that blazes red in October exactly as planned. He built it all so carefully. 40 years, every joint fitted before the next was begun. He built it for me, and I am still here, in it, and I am not going anywhere. And no one, not at any age, not under any circumstances, will put their hand on my arm and walk me to the door of my own house and shut it behind me. Not twice, not ever again. I poured the last of the coffee. The morning settled around me. The birds sorted out whatever it was they needed to sort out. Harold's jacket hung in the hall in a bar of sunlight, the tweed shoulders warm, the leather patches worn to the texture of something that has been held and held and held. I looked at it. I drank my coffee. And it was, for the first time in a very long time, exactly as it should be.